So welcome to our session this afternoon, Equity Through Rigorous Text for All Students. In the chat box, Michelle and I have been putting a link to a Padlet. That Padlet is your one-stop shop for resources. It has the handouts for today, and it also has additional resources, lots of additional resources on topics that we are going to discuss with you this afternoon. So my name is Carolyn Turner. I'm one of the Ohio Literacy Leads. I live in the Cincinnati area, but I work statewide with the Department of Approaches to Teaching and Professional Learning in providing professional development to help scale up Ohio's plan to raise literacy achievement. And I have with me the other half of my brain, Michelle Elia, and I will let her introduce herself to you.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Michelle Elia and I live up in the Youngstown area, and together Carolyn and I managed to cover this lovely state doing professional learning in the science of reading, and we invite you to check out some of our other professional development to learn more about any of the topics we discussed today. So welcome, we're glad you're here.
We are glad you're here. And we have a lot to cover today. So we are going to be talking very, very fast. So if you have questions, throw them in the chat box and we'll get to them as we see them and as they apply to the content that we're going through. So Michelle and we have not had an original thought in the last probably 10 years or so. So this presentation are not thoughts that just come to us in our sleep. These are thoughts and works from a variety of different work groups and experts, both nationally and internationally. And we want to thank the people that are on the screen. We have Anita Archer. Many of you have seen her present across the country and in our state. Tim Shanahan, of course, has been a valued partner in all of our Ohio work, our friends from Learning Forward. Michelle has put together a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into all of the work that we do across the state as well. So please know that these thoughts, the work that we share, the research that we share, these are work that are coming to you from our national and international experts. You want to talk about our goals today, Michelle?
Sure, I can do that. Okay, we have 4 sections to today's professional development. First, we're going to develop a rationale, explain kind of the why for using complex grade level text for all students. Then we're going to do some simulations where we will experience the impact of leveled and less rigorous text on student vocabulary, comprehension, and knowledge of language structures. We will understand the importance of text sets as a wonderful tool to support readers in building background knowledge, vocabulary, and also for scaffolding so students can access complex text. And last but not least, we will learn how and why to scaffold complex text to ensure student access. As Carolyn mentioned, we're probably going to go fast through a lot of content, but we are also going to give you additional resources. Hopefully this will perk your interest into this topic, and then you will seek additional professional learning on this topic, maybe with us or with other experts across the country. We hope that this is going to be just the start of your journey into the use of complex text and that you'll want to dig deeper. Since we have such a small group as well, it would be lovely if you have the capacity to turn on your camera. Carolyn and I don't like talking to ourselves because quite frankly, all we do is talk to ourselves or each other basically for the last year and a half. So if you have the ability to turn on your camera, we would love to see your faces. We do like to engage. And as Carolyn mentioned earlier, please use the chat or just ask us a question. We want this to be a conversation with all of you so that we can learn and grow together.
Absolutely. And really the reason why we're here is because we want all of our students, including and especially those that struggle, to have the opportunity to acquire and be capable of using all of their language and cognitive skills. These cognitive skills are necessary for making meaning of text. That's the goal of reading. And we have to integrate all of those skills. And whether we're reading by eye or ear, comprehension is complex. It's not as you're going to find, it's not a series of little isolated skills that we teach. It's a well-oiled machine and a well-orchestrated product of 2 very particular domains. And we'll talk about those this afternoon. So to kind of kick us off, you're gonna have a little quiz, and this is a very low stakes quiz. It is a no judgment quiz, but think about this statement. To help students practice reading skills, teachers should give students text at their instructional level rather than reading grade level text. I'm going to launch this poll, and what do you think about that? Do you think that's true, or do you think that's false? To help students practice reading skills, teachers should give students text at their instructional level rather than grade level text. Let's see, we've got about 3/4 of you have answered. We'll give it about another 10 seconds or so.
And while you're voting, if we don't see your first and last name, if you don't mind renaming yourself so we can see your first and last name, that would be super helpful. And if you don't mind letting us know where you're from, we always love to know that too. You can easily rename yourself by hovering over your video feed and clicking on the 3 dots, drag it down to rename. So we would love to know your names and, if you can, where you're from.
All right, I am going to go ahead and stop the poll, end the polling, and share the results. And it's an interesting phenomenon that happens when we ask this question about giving students grade level text versus texts that are on their instructional level. And the answer actually to this question is false. We are going to be creating a rationale, helping to build a rationale about the use of grade level and above text with all students. Now, there is a caveat to that, because in other sessions that we've done on other strands, we talk about decodable text, where you're practicing the foundational skills. Those are a little bit different than what we're going to talk about today. We are mostly working on giving access to complex text to all readers at all grade levels. And to read more about that and why we are focusing on this grade level versus instructional level text, you can read the article, Why Americans Haven't Gotten Better at Reading in 20 Years, and it is in your Padlet. But our focus today is going to be to develop this rationale. The article does do it, but we're going to take you through a series of steps and talk to you about why using complex grade level text with all students is so critical for academic success. Because in this country, literacy really is the language of opportunity. When students can read, when they can acquire the necessary language and vocabulary skills, that leads to greater outcomes in education and greater outcomes in life. And our students of poverty tend to have very limited experiences with language and vocabulary. They come to us already not where they need to be in their language experiences. And this can often lead to deficits in knowledge, just sheer knowing about the world and how the world operates. We find that there are racial and socioeconomic achievement gaps, and those are large. They're unyielding, and they haven't changed much over the past 20 years. And so what we know now is that our content area instruction is really critical in cutting this gap and limiting the effects of this knowledge and equity gap that we see. And when we center on content area instruction and the knowledge that content area instruction can impose, then we can cut this gap in terms of knowledge and equity. And so reading comprehensions, but programs, they don't build knowledge, or they don't tend to build knowledge. They tend to teach skills, these isolated skills. And that's not really what builds overall comprehension in our students. All right, it's really the building of vocabulary and knowledge and the teaching of those word recognition skills to bridge over into language comprehension. That's how we build a good, strong reading brain. And we build that strong.
Carolyn, I want to interject really fast, because one of the things, to your point, is that content area instruction is so important, but it's often cut. and it's cut in terms of when we don't have enough time, especially at the elementary level, we take out content area instruction in order to make sure we fit everything else in. And now our students are going to come move into the higher level grades without that background knowledge that's so critical. So we know that contributes to the problems that we see in students in terms of lack of knowledge and lack of vocabulary and lack of knowledge of complex language structures as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that, girl.
That's okay. No, I did that firsthand when I taught third grade. If I was running out of time in my day, guess what got cut? Science and social studies. And those really are the critical elements in helping build that strong reading brain. We know from Marilyn Adams that giving children easier text when they're weaker readers actually denies them language. It denies them information that they're going to need to catch up with their grade level peers and move on to those higher levels of reading. So we cannot cut out those complex texts. We have to devise ways to scaffold and build the information and knowledge necessary to allow them access to those texts. We know this from research, right? If you've ever followed the blog and the information from Tim Shanahan, he is one of the largest proponents of rigorous text and giving rigorous text to struggling readers. He cites the research. He says that research indicates that students actually, they learn more from reading texts that are considered too difficult for them. We're going to take you through some simulations that show you that if you just read some little isolated pieces of information, you don't learn near as much as you would by having access to that grade level and complex text. Now, we're not just going to hand these complex texts to students. He goes on to say that what they need is they need the guidance from the teacher. Giving students rigorous text puts the teacher back into the equation. That's our job, right? That's our job, is to make that text accessible for the students who need to read it. And so using those complex texts allows teachers to come back into the equation and really help to move their students forward with those texts. So quick question for you, have another poll. Think about, and you may have heard this term before, you may have heard this term about the Matthew effect. What exactly is the Matthew effect? And if for some reason you can't see the poll, it might be tucked behind your screen. And if you absolutely can't find it, don't stress, just type your answer in the chat box. Got about 80% of you. Just need about 4 more people if you wouldn't mind answering.
We probably should have warned them that we are definitely not set it and forget it kind of webinar people. We are not the kind of presenters that you could just turn this on and then multitask your way through the session. We like to hear from you. We like you to participate, and because that's how learning happens, right?
It is.
I really wanted, I was looking to see your faces to kind of gauge, that first poll about using grade level versus leveled text. How are you guys feeling about that? Feel free to put a reaction up and let us know how you're feeling about that. Is that something that kind of rocked your world? Something that makes you uncomfortable? Something that makes you happy? You have those reaction tools on the bottom. We'd love to know how you're feeling about this content. Oh, Luke, I love that. I've been screaming this. That's awesome. Yeah.
And some cheers and some claps. That's fantastic. I guess that's why they're here, right? To get that confirmation that this is the right thing to do. All right. So the Matthew effect. So the Matthew effect, it's a theory. And it's the theory that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And it really, it stems from, biblical verses. But when we think about it in terms of education, our students who are low in their foundational skills, those word recognition skills and decoding skills, tend to start to read less as they get a little bit older and the texts get more difficult. And as they read less, then they don't acquire the knowledge that they need. They don't acquire the vocabulary that they need. They don't acquire the complex sentence structures or be exposed to the complex sentence structures that they need. And it's this endless cycle. And that's where the poverty gap and that's where the knowledge gap really comes into play. Is that, did I not share the results? Did I share the results? There we go. Okay.
You did share them. I stopped sharing while
gotcha.
you were talking. But yeah,
Okay.
you shared them.
All right, perfect. All right, so yeah, so that's the Matthew effect. It's that rich get richer, poor get poorer. And when we give students and we teach students through these methods, that will help to close that gap as students get older, and then they will be able to read those texts to learn more. More is given, more is expected. Well, we want to do that, right? We want to give them more, okay? And those who have more do more. Those who have more ability to read will do more with that ability to read. And so all of this ties into the Matthew effect or the Matthew principle.
And definitely check out Keith Stanovich's work because, Steve, to your point, no, it is the Matthew effect. And Keith Stanovich is actually the one who coined that phrase, applying it to education and to literacy specifically, although he stole it from economics, who stole it from the Bible. But, that's beside the point.
Tomato. All right, Michelle, you want to talk about our instructional shifts and how all of this applies back to our standards as well?
Absolutely. Okay. So, the shifts in the Ohio's learning standards, this isn't new. This is something that we learned about this, 10 years ago. I remember going to tons of professional development with student achievement partners talking about these shifts, right? And so this isn't new, but I think it's worth repeating because it really does validate the message that we are conveying today and the research that we are sharing with you all today. So the shifts in the standards included, number one, complexity. So regular practice with complex text. And I think that that's really worth noting, practice with the complex text. In addition, we have evidence. So reading, writing, and speaking, and we do stress this all the time, we should be reading and writing and engaging in discourse. And when we talk about that speaking, it's using whatever mode of communication our students use. So that doesn't necessarily mean oral language. It could incorporate other modes of communication, but that's grounded in the evidence of from the text. So later we'll talk about Anita Archer, keeping students in the text, not out of the text, in the text, not out of the text. We want to use that evidence. And then knowledge, building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction for our students. And then if you've ever had a chance to listen to David Lieben, he argues that he was one of the authors of the Common Core Standards, and he works with Achieve the Core and Student Achievement Partners. And he argues that if he could rewrite these shifts, he would have included a fourth shift, which would have been a focus on foundational skills, because he didn't realize that so many students were not being taught these foundational skills explicitly and systematically. And he did a really wonderful presentation on this topic for the literacy symposium that we had a chance to listen to. And he really talked about the significance of explicitly teaching foundational skills to students so that they can access complex text and achieve the other shifts. So in order to help you with this, our boss and Carolyn and I worked with our colleague and we developed this wonderful chart to kind of explain what this looks like in terms of previous practices, but then also how it shifts to our newer practices. So we want to definitely give credit here to Beth Hess as well in the development of this lovely chart. So as we think of complexity, our previous practice may have been what we had talked about earlier in that poll, the use of leveled text. But now we know that we need to move to grade level text, and there should be a 50-50 split in terms of making sure we give our students informational text and fiction. So we want to have that 50-50 split. But so we're not just using fiction, we have a mix of fiction and nonfiction. But the shift is away from the leveled text and moving into grade level text, high rigor. And then when it comes to evidence, our previous practice may have been to ask a lot of text to self questions, whereas now we're going to move to text dependent questions first, keeping students in the text, not out of the text to start, and then we can help them connect it to themselves. When it comes to knowledge, we used to maybe use unrelated texts to practice these skills, right? These strategies. And we know the strategies are absolutely important, but we were using a lot of unrelated text, disconnected text in order to teach a strategy. And now our shift is using text sets to maximize vocabulary and background knowledge to enhance comprehension. And then last but not least, and this is the one that is not the topic of today, but Carolyn and I obviously talk about a lot in our work across the state, which was foundational skills instructions, which in the past may have been taught implicitly, if at all. And now we know we need explicit systematic phonemic awareness and phonics instruction to build fluency. So these are the shifts. And this is a wonderful chart that we know people have been using across the state and discussing across the state as we work to for evidence-based language and literacy practices in our literacy instruction. Okay, Carolyn, go ahead and click it. So if you want some help in moving to shifting to evidence-based language and literacy practices, Student Achievement Partners and Achieve the Core have created a fabulous document. We linked it in the Padlet. It's called Guidance for Educators Using a Balanced Literacy Program, talking about how we can make this shift to using more grade level text and rigorous text for all students. So consequently, the demands of our Common Core are ELA standards and regular practice with grade appropriate text, regardless of the reading level of the student, is going to be really critical, right? We know that we demand and our students need to be able to have skills to work with these texts. The idea is that teacher support and explanation, not text difficulty, is what should be differentiated. So this came from the Fordham report and from the Fordham Institute, but Shanahan talks about this as well. We tend to think of differentiation in terms of differentiating the actual product, but we can differentiate our instruction and the scaffolding that we provide. And actually in the Padlet, there's a link to a session that I did for one of our ODE meetups on scaffolding complex text if you want to get more information on that. But without differentiating our instruction so all students can access complex text, some of our struggling readers are never going to catch up. Okay, now we're going to move into the simulation. And this simulation activity is one that Carolyn and I have done across the state. And it's been really, really powerful to stress why we want our students to engage with complex, rigorous texts on a daily basis and not always level down to where they are. And so I'll take in the activity and explain to you what we did. So in your Padlet, there is an article about owls. So if you want to read the article or the article in its three forms, it is in your Padlet. So the first time we did this activity, it was near Christmas time. So we happened to choose an article about an owl in the Christmas tree in New York City. And so what we did was we pulled the article and looked at the vocabulary in the grade level article. So the grade level article had a Lexile level of about 820. I think it was like fifth grade, fifth grade was the article grade level equivalent. And so we went through the article and pulled out all of the wonderful vocabulary that we recognized in this article. So words like undomesticated, nonprofit, rehabilitate, iconic, mocking. So we went through this article and found all this great vocabulary and wrote it down. The primary term that is here in red is raptor, because owls are raptors, and that was kind of the point of the article, was to teach about raptors, right? So we found all this great words: metaphor, bedraggled, stowaway, possibilities, chaos, relieved, refuge, fracture, strive, honored. Great words, right? For the word nerds in the group, you're like, this is some juicy text, right? The kids are really going to love this. So we found all this wonderful vocabulary. But then I remember, when I was an intervention specialist, what I would do for my students, because this text was so challenging, I would go and I'd find another version of the same text and I'd give them that lower level version, right? That's what I used to do when I was an intervention specialist. Know better, do better, by the way. But I used to do that. So we went and found a lower level version of the text. So here you see the below level reader with the 620 Lexile. And so we once again went through and found the vocabulary in that text. And we noticed that many of these words, undomesticated, nonprofit, they were no longer there. So I tried to find the most sophisticated words I could find in this one, and I found surprised, rescued, sagging, unwrapping, prey, needles, creature, squished, surprised, impressed, preparing. None of these wonderful, beautiful, juicy words were in the lower level passage. So then we went to the next level below, because I remember, again, as an intervention specialist, I had students reading multiple grade levels below, and we pulled that passage out. And we looked at the vocabulary and tried to find the most sophisticated language we could in that one. And the words, the most challenging words we could find were rescue, spotted, based, hunting, tucked, and carrier. None of these words were over here, just like none of these were over here. So we started to see there's something going on when it comes to exposure to vocabulary that is very inequitable when it comes to our kids. Students who are getting these lower level texts are not getting access to the same vocabulary as their peers. So here's where we're going to interject a quick mini lesson on vocabulary. So hopefully you're familiar with Beck's work on vocabulary. It's in the standards. They refer to academic language as tier 2 words in Ohio Standards for English Language Arts. And so Beck, McEwen, and Amundsen actually talk about these 3 tiers of vocabulary. Yeah, bringing words to life. Thank you, Carolyn. Okay, so the 3 tiers. We have, Guy, if you want to click, Carolyn, tier 1 words, basic conversational words. We don't have to teach them because most kids know them. However, our English learners sometimes need instruction in tier 1. Then we have tier 2 words. Now we're getting into academic language. In fact, in the standards, tier 2 words are referred to as academic language. So these are words that can be used across all content areas, but that are really going to help with comprehension, because this is the language we're going to see in test questions. This is the language of academia, right? And then we have, last but not least, those tier 3 words. Now, tier 3 words are very much content-specific words. They're associated with the disciplines, right? Science, social studies, math. But these are also words that have to be taught because, they're very discipline-specific and tend to be very complex as well. So tier 2 and tier 3 words are the words that we know we're going to have to teach, and we have to build a knowledge base for our kids with, right? Because those are the words that they're going to see in academic content areas and across all subject areas. So those are the words we have to teach. Okay, so let's go back to that passage now. So what we did is we color-coded the passage. We highlighted the vocabulary that was tier 1, words we don't have to teach, that all kids know. And then we highlighted yellow, words that were tier 2, academic language that we have to teach, and tier 3, content-specific language we have to teach. And what do you think we noticed? What passages had more tier 2 and tier 3? The grade level or the low level?
Go ahead and unmute or type in the chat box. Which one had grade level?
Absolutely. So here you have your color-coded example. Take a look at, where'd it go? There it is. Take a look at the grade level. So this is like I said, I think it's a 5th grade passage. Take a look at the grade level passage. We found a lot of juicy words, tier 2, tier 3, wonderful, sophisticated language, right? But then as we went down to the lower level passage, we recognized that there really weren't many tier 2 or tier 3 words, but there were a lot of tier 1 words. And as we went down even lower still, we found even fewer tier 2 and tier 3 and more tier 1 words. The most sophisticated language we could find in the well below passage were carrier and raptor. And for many students, I could argue that carrier is tier 1. They don't even need instruction in that. So going back to what Carolyn said about Tim Shanahan, this is where we come in. When we use sophisticated text, it does require more of our effort and our work, but it brings us back into the table, working with these kids, helping to teach them this critical vocabulary. Because when we give them lower level text, we are taking away their access to the vocabulary they need to be successful. That is the equity issue. Okay, that was a little serious. Go ahead, Carolyn, take them to their activity.
That was. But this whole section is on providing that rationale, right? So this is the rationale for why we're using complex text with all of our students. And then later on, we'll talk a little bit about how we bridge the gap between perhaps their current abilities and where they are in accessing those texts. But this is all providing the rationale. So you all are not going to have about 8 minutes to kind of play around with this a little bit and explore this in another aspect, in much the same way that we did with this passage. So in your Padlet, and let me bring it up here, you have a column that says, what's the difference? So if you brought up the Padlet, you'll see this column, what's the difference? And we're going to give you about 8 minutes in a breakout room. And what we'd like you to do is take a look at the 3 articles that are in the Padlet. So just scan those 3 articles. There are 3 different levels of one article. And this time I want you to focus on the language structures, the sentence structures, the complexity of the language within the sentence, and even the content knowledge that's provided. And after you've had a chance to scan individually those 3 articles, then have a quick group discussion about what you noticed. How does the language change in each level? What's that impact? What's the impact now on students if that language changes in each of those passages? And what are the implications in terms of equity? What's the variance in building background knowledge? So you have this slide to remind you what your kind of your discussion points, and then you have each of these articles. Okay? Does anybody have any questions? So you're going to go into your breakout rooms. You're going to access the Padlet, and you're going to review the articles and talk about the complexity at each level. Okay? All right. Open up the rooms. We'll see you back in about 8 minutes.
We're back. Carolyn, I don't know. I know you got a chance to bebop around. I did not. I stayed in one group, but we had such great conversation. Like I said,
I'm glad. So what were you guys finding out in those 3 articles at 3 different levels?
Somebody unmute and talk to us.
Yeah, this is where we need some audience participation. That was the interactive part of it. It's hard to sit for 2 hours and just listen.
So this is Emily Rosmus, and I was sharing with our group that, hi Michelle, that one thing I noticed was the lack of depth in the language, and as it went down in levels, you really lost some of those nuances that I think are so key to understanding reading, where you have to kind of figure out what is implicitly there as opposed to what's explicitly stated, which, you know, it's very clear in those lower level reading versions. Plus the sentence structure, of course, is much different. So you're never, you know, helping kids be exposed to some of that more complex way of sharing that information. So I think it's a loss of the richness that I think was fully intended to be there in that original text.
Yeah. Amanda, you have your hand up. Thank you, Emily.
To build on what Emily said, we also talked about those 2 factors, and then we talked about, you know, just the difference in, you know, when I graduated from college 10 years ago and to now when it comes to differentiating texts, and, you know, between sharing those texts and providing the scaffolding with the grade level text is, you know, great, but also one of my colleagues in our group talked about chunking texts to give them pieces of that grade level text without it feeling overwhelming, so that it's a more attainable goal. And just the value, like we had said earlier, you had said in the presentation earlier, of, you know, it adds a teacher back into the equation, where we need to be doing more in-person, like I do, we do, you do sort of practice with the concept, as opposed to just assigning students a big chunk of a text and expecting them to be either intrinsically or extrinsically rewarded by doing this process on their own.
Maya, you want to add to that?
Yeah, so something that I really noticed is that not just is the vocabulary so much more complex in the higher reading level, but the length is so much longer. And something that I think is so important is reading endurance. And some of our kids who have that lower equity and are struggling, you hear them say so often, like, oh, I hate reading, or I don't like reading like books or novels because they're so long. And so, you know, making sure that we're scaffolding our kids to be able to read longer and longer texts, I think is really important. Chunking is a great way to do that. But just ensuring that they're getting that length is really important.
Yeah, yeah. One of our things that we always say, Michelle just put it in the chat box, is it's hard to love something that you struggle to do. You know, we all have that something that we're not very good at, and that's probably the thing that we least like of anything. And that's the same with reading, exactly. And so you have these slides, you have the handout in the Padlet. You also have access to those 3 articles. Perhaps this would be a good conversation starter, maybe in a PLC or a teacher-based team, or even with a building leadership team, a district leadership team, to really prompt and engage in this conversation about the rationale and the importance of these complex texts for all students, because it is an equity issue, both in terms of building knowledge, but also in terms of building just the sheer amount of vocabulary that children are going to need as they progress through school. So we really want to be intentional in the text that we choose, because the texts that we choose do play a major role. They are the building blocks. Those are the weights, if you will, in strengthening the mental models. You know, if we think about our brain and all of the the surrounding information that we have coming in, that's the mental model. Things that we know, things that we learn, things that we read, we stir all of those areas together in our brain, and that's how we build those processors in the brain of this good model for later language acquisition. It also helps eventually in our word recognition as well, because it's hard to retrieve a word from decoding that we haven't heard before from the start. So all of this plays into that strong language and literacy development. So now we built this, we really built this rationale. Okay, this is why we do all this. This really is the equity piece in learning. And this is where the teacher comes back into the equation. And we really now want to understand where text sets come into this, because we presented one article, whether it be the OWL article or the Swedish community article, but really it's all about how we use text sets to support building background knowledge and vocabulary acquisition. So let's just do a very quick reading simulation. I'm going to share with you a passage, okay? And when you're done reading the passage, I want you to be prepared to either defend or refute this statement. And the statement is, communication between the temporal and occipital lobe leads to fluent word recognition. So you're going to read this short article, this short passage, and be prepared to defend or refute that statement. Communication between the temporal and occipital lobe leads to fluent word recognition. Here you go. Here's your passage.
This is where seeing all your faces would be lovely when we present this in a
And
big room.
Flip page to page 2 of the article.
Everyone's faces, yeah, they all put their hands on their head just like that. Yes, like, oh my gosh, what are you making me read?
To be quite honest with you, this, like a student, I can't do it. I mean, it's too much, because if I can't get the first few words, I'm going to tune it out, and that's what I'm doing. it makes no sense to me. So you
Paulette, I
lost me.
could kiss you. That is
Paulette,
exactly the point
no.
of this activity.
Summarize the whole, so we're going to put you out of your misery. Okay. And let's talk about this for just a brief bit. Paulette pretty much summarized her frustration, right? As an adult reader, her frustration. That passage was challenging. Okay. What was challenging about it? Just real quick, type in the chat box. What was challenging? Vocabulary. Good. What else? Unfamiliar vocabulary, medical jargon, sentence structure. Yep, you got it. Putting yourself in a science frame of mind. Okay, the genre piece of it, not jargon, right? Yeah, so we didn't have adequate background knowledge, right? We also struggled with that complex vocabulary. Perhaps you found it boring because you didn't know anything about the topic, and there was some pretty complex sentence structures. Well, this is what happens with our students when we just simply present a text for them to read. This is what happens when we take the teacher out of the equation. Now, let's put the teacher back into the equation. And what if we had asked you to perhaps watch this video first? And we're just going to real quick play this video to see if this may have helped in dissecting that article.
Learning to read creates
Oops, sorry.
neural pathways between the different brain areas important for learning to read. In the beginning of learning to read, we need to focus on mapping the sounds of language onto the letters. It is primarily done by the triangle between the fusiform gyrus, the superior temporal gyrus, and the perisylvian regions. Key areas for learning to read somehow need to communicate with each other. This is done by long axons, also called white matter tracts. You then connect these different areas to the CEO of the reading network, or the inferior frontal gyrus. Basic research has told us a lot about how the brain is learning to read.
And we're still not going to give you that article yet.
So we show you the video, and then we read this article together. And I know this is probably pretty small,
And we're not going to ask you to read it.
and we're not
We're
going to
just-
ask you to read it. But what do you notice about this article versus the first article? Just as I scroll through, what do you notice about it?
It has headers and subheadings, all of that to kind of guide, chunk things together.
Yep. Yeah, I see Luke said it's got headings, it has graphics. There were some tables up at the beginning. Key points are bulleted out to focus. Okay.
More accessible. I love
More
that word. It is
accessible.
more accessible of an article. But is it a leveled down simple article? No, it's still complex, right? But it is more accessible. And it's still complex, but it's not as complex as that very first article. It's not as challenging as that first one, but it's still challenging.
So
But now we're building your knowledge.
Yep, absolutely. So we watch the video. We give you a little bit more knowledge through a more accessible text, but not not a dummied down text or a watered down text. It's a more accessible article because of the graphics and the tables and the bulleted points and the headings. And then we can give, and maybe we might need some more stair steps up to it. But eventually we're going to create a ladder, a scaffold of supports that build your knowledge, build your vocabulary so that you can read that more complex text more effectively and efficiently. So when we stair step text, it gives sufficient background knowledge and vocabulary to fill in those gaps. That's why texts are hard. They don't have our students don't have some of the background. We obviously didn't have some of the background necessary to read that more complex text. But if they have multiple texts available to them on the same topic, perhaps at varying levels of difficulty, they can build up that critical knowledge, and that's what helps them aid in comprehension. Tim Shanahan did a presentation at our Literacy Academy a few years ago, and his presentation is linked in this presentation if you'd like to watch that and learn a little bit more about the stair-stepping of text to build that critical content, vocabulary, and background knowledge. Go ahead, Michelle.
No, and one of the things that I want to stress about these easier or apprentice texts that we're going to use in our stair-step text, as you noticed, we gave you the Reading Rockets article as more of an apprentice text. It was a slightly easier, more accessible, more relaxed. I liked that, Steve. Emily said it put the brain science in context. It made it applicable. This apprentice text is not given to, oh, my lower reader. Okay, so Meredith, she struggles, she gets the lower text, and Julie, she doesn't, so she gets the other article. That's not how it works. What we're doing is we're giving all students access to all of those texts to build their knowledge base, to get them ready for the more challenging text. So these easier apprentice texts help students build the background knowledge for more difficult texts. And Shanahan talks about this in his presentation at our Literacy Academy, but the Fordham Institute report that we also hyperlinked in our notes discusses this as well as a critical scaffolding tool. And so someone said we need to increase volume of reading, right? We know that that's to increase that stamina for reading, but what we do that through those text sets, because we're systematically, step-by-step, building their knowledge, building up their stamina for reading, and accelerating the rate of learning the new vocabulary. New vocabulary is going to stick significantly better because they're seeing that vocabulary over and over and over again. And then in addition, we're scaffolding the instruction for our struggling readers. And there's the Fordham report on that topic too, if you want more information. So what the heck should a well-constructed text set include? Well, Student Achievement Partners, Achieve the Core, they have given us some wonderful ideas and helpful tips. Number one topic. So find a topic, unit, or theme. Daniel Willingham, cognitive scientist, says, make sure we connect that unit or theme in our elementary grades to our content areas. Obviously, in our secondary grades, we're going to use our content area topic for our themes, but use multiple texts around one theme. And then include a variety of resources. So when I say texts, I use that kind of in a general term, because Roger Howard, if he was here, he would say, well, texts aren't just the print that we hold in our hands, right? Texts can include books, they can include videos, they can include articles, infographics are great texts, right? Websites. So a little shout out to InfoHio. This is a wonderful resource to go to gather these variety of resources in varying complexity to create a text set if you don't have a curriculum that includes one. And then these resources are purposefully ordered. So the order we give them to our students is intentional. We're moving up to the more challenging text, the most challenging text at the end, but also in a way that's going to build their exposure to the vocabulary. So when we started with that video, well, that's number one, a hook, but also it's going to be their first exposure to that vocabulary in that language. And then we progressively build up. So there's a method to the madness. And then we have our students engage with the text. After each text, they're engaging. So there's going to be some sort of activities for them to do so that they can demonstrate that they are in fact building knowledge, whether it be a discussion. I mean, it could be simple. It doesn't have to be very complex. It doesn't have to be a test. It could just be having a discussion with a prompt, right? So that they're going to engage with each text and have an activity where they're going to make sure they're building knowledge.
They could make an initial drawing of the brain after watching the video and work with a partner to label some just preliminary parts of the brain and sections of the brain.
I know we have a lot of high school friends in the audience here. So I'm a recovering high school intervention specialist, and I love Lupo's quad text framework. If you get a chance to, and maybe we should add this to the Padlet, Sarah Lupo's session on her quad text framework. We'll add that into the Padlet for you. If you get a chance to see anything that she does, I really am a big fan of her work. And so she suggests, we have this challenging target text. Then what we want to have in addition to that is 3 additional texts or resources, a visual or a video, another informational text, and something that's a little bit more accessible to get them to where they need to go. Any of these other 3 on the outside of the circle can be our starting point. They're all going to get us to the challenging text. So the idea is that we work up, step up to get to the more challenging text. So when we use grade level text sets, we train the brain in the good habit of, number 1, navigating complex text structures, which you all talked about, that complex sentence structure, giving them exposure to compound and complex sentences and really sophisticated language. But we're also building vocabulary, and we're building background knowledge, and we're connecting to the background knowledge they're gaining from each of these texts. Okay, Carolyn, you want to talk for a little while?
I sure will. Okay, so as we round out our afternoon session together, let's talk a little bit about how and why. We really already talked about why we scaffold, right? But let's talk a little bit more about how we do all this, because we're really going to be accessing several areas in order to ensure that students have access to these complex texts. Because here's what we know about comprehension, okay? Comprehension is not a thing. It's not a single entity. It can't be explained by just one simple definition. It's really a product. And we haven't talked much about the simple view of reading. We usually start all of our sessions with the simple view of reading. But if we think about the simple view of reading, where we know that word recognition times language comprehension, and the product of word recognition and language comprehension is reading comprehension. And it's that very skilled, orchestrated product of those 2 domains. It's what we know linguistically, but it's also the cognitive processes, the underlying areas of the brain that are working together to really concentrate on that text. It's that building of the mental model where you're bringing in background knowledge and vocabulary knowledge, plus what you're reading from the text. That's what comprehension is. And in order to have comprehension, we have to be understanding what we read. It's actually a process. It's the act of understanding what we're reading. It's not necessarily a product or something that we, produce and then, hand in and check off and give to our teacher. But it's the act of making meaning and understanding what we're reading. It's extracting that meaning from what we're reading. It's understanding what we're reading and also what we're bringing in from our prior knowledge. And then it's making sense of all of that. Comprehension in and of itself, that is the outcome. That is the goal. It's not isolated sets of strategies. If you've ever read or would like to read more about that, you can read Natalie Wexler's The Knowledge Gap. She does an excellent job of explaining what happens when we teach isolated sets of skills, comprehension skills, versus a really truly comprehensive core knowledge building, reading and science and social studies. So it's an outcome. It's not a series of strategies. The problem is, like we said before, many of our core programs teach the strategies rather than the knowledge that's needed to actually, that we need to actually be good comprehenders. But let's also think about what's happening with comprehension. So lots of things are working simultaneously, right? It's a well-oiled machine. We have to be able to read the words on the page because honestly, there's no comprehension strategy powerful enough for not being able to read the words on the page. We have to understand the meanings of the words. We have to have adequate background knowledge, and we have to focus on the critical content of the piece. That's why those text sets that build on one topic, that helps build that critical content. Now, we're not going to go into great detail about reading the words accurate and fluently. That can be a whole, day-long, month-long, year-long session all in and of itself. But basically, when we talk about reading the words accurately and fluently, we have to understand why that is. because cognitive science has shown beyond a doubt that fluent, accurate word recognition is a hallmark of skilled reading with comprehension. And Joe Torgerson says it best: there is no comprehension strategy powerful enough to compensate for not being able to read the words. So if you're finding that you do have students who are not able to read the words on the page, you do have to teach those skills. And there's a checklist, there's a series of kind of next steps to think about how your school site is going to work towards better word recognition, that decoding process. So just a few checklists to help you. And again, we've got sessions on that. We talk about this all the time, and it's kind of a topic that needs a little bit more discussion than what we have time for this afternoon, but it is a critical piece of comprehension. We also have to understand the meanings of words, because if we can read the words on the page, but we don't understand what those words mean, that's going to interfere with our comprehension. And one of the most enduring findings in reading research is the extent to which students' vocabulary knowledge relates to their reading comprehension. Okay, so we have to be able to understand those words, read them, and understand them. And our brain also has to have been exposed and been created in these semantic networks of words. It's not about words in isolation, but it's how words relate to other words and how words relate to other topics. And in order to do that, we have to give students multiple exposures to words and usage of words and encourage word usage. We have to define the words, and by define, we kind of have to tell them sometimes what the words mean. You know, the dictionary is helpful, but it's not all that helpful at times. We also have to define and use that contextual information from the text. That's where context comes into play when we're thinking about vocabulary instruction. But we also have to encourage active participation. Michelle's going to take you through a simulation of teaching a word, but you have to be an active participant in learning that word, because if not, you're not going to have the deep processing that's needed to actually know the word so that it really is truly your best friend. You know that word and the ins and the outs of that word. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Michelle, how do you want to do this?
I'm going to just share. I'm sharing mine right over top of yours, and it'll just share it. There we go. Hopefully that was pretty seamless.
There you go.
And I want to address some questions that have been coming up in the chat too, Carolyn. You know, we gave an example with nonfiction, but what about fiction? And we get that question a lot from ELA folks at the high school level. The good news is a lot of the new knowledge-based curricula actually include text sets that have a mixture of fiction and nonfiction that are wonderful. So you don't have to spend your time curating the instructional materials. But what we usually suggest is that there is a nice mixture. So if your target text is, for example, Shakespeare or a novel, then you're going to find additional apprentice texts that maybe have something related to the time period. So maybe connect with, history teachers, connect with folks in science, anyone in other content areas to kind of make some sort of connection between the topics in the text. So it could be a unit or a theme. But you want to make sure that you create your unit with a nice mixture of fiction and nonfiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, even if you think about it, if you're a high school English teacher and you think about some of the texts you teach, many of them have historical context to them, and they have geographical context to them. And so they have to, if you're teaching Great Gatsby, you have to know what the period dress was like, or where Long Island is, or you have to kind of put the reader in the situation. That's that situational model, that mental model you're creating. You have to put the reader in the situation of the text.
And Michelle said Pearson has a good mix. Yeah, my perspective, I know, has a lot of text sets, Wit and Wisdom, CKLA, EL, Expeditionary Learning. A lot of those include text sets that have that nice mixture. But Achieve the Core, go to Achieve the Core to the text set builder. They have wonderful resources right there for you. And I know that Emily also shared resources from InfOhio, so to help you. But really making sure you make that connection across content areas is critical. Okay. So let's talk about vocabulary, because one of the best ways to make sure our students can access this complex text, as Carolyn mentioned, is ensure, number one, our students know how to decode. And I know we have a lot of middle school and high school folks here today as well. If they're in middle school and high school and they don't know how to decode, their tier 2 interventions need to include explicit phonics interventions in order to make sure that they know how to decode multisyllabic words. So it can't just be basic phonics, but moving into advanced phonics as well. So if your students can't decode, we can't just read aloud. We want to intervene appropriately and teach them how to decode. But we also want to analyze our core instruction in our younger grades to make sure explicit decoding is happening down there. That's a soapbox issue for another day, but we want to make sure that you are aware of, how important that is.
And we can
Okay.
go on and on about that. Go ahead.
Yes, we could spend days. But let's talk about then vocabulary, because we do want to explicitly teach vocabulary before engaging with the text, during the reading of text, and then after text. So we want to make sure that we're constantly introducing our students to the words. And some of the vocabulary our students encounter, they're going to learn just through the process of reading the complex text, but not all. So what we want to do is pick out a few words before each time we engage with the text, and we're going to pre-teach those. And then other words our students will read or will learn by reading the text. So as we are teaching these words explicitly, we're going to use Anita Archer's explicit instruction routine, which starts off with the pronunciation. And I also want to add the orthography or the orthographic components. So step 1 is the pronunciation and orthography. Step 2 is where we go to meaning. Usually we teach vocabulary, we write the word on the board and we tell the kids what they mean. I'm going to back it up. We're going to start with pronunciation and orthography, then go to meaning, then give examples and non-examples, and then check for student understanding. So in order to do this, you guys are going to need to either unmute by pressing and holding the space bar, so you can mute and unmute. Try that. Press the space bar, say good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Ooh,
Good afternoon.
yay, it's
Good afternoon.
good, good. Okay, because I'm going to ask for you to participate in some of these. I'll be the teacher, you'll all be the kids, okay? And we purposefully, I get these words of the day sent to my phone, and we picked a word that we didn't think you'd know. It was a word that Carolyn and I didn't know, and we went through and taught ourselves this word. So it's brand new. Okay, so step 1, we're going to talk about pronunciation. And we're going to do this by repeating the word, but also by counting the syllables in the word. And my friend Roger, one of my favorite people in the world, he said, Michelle, high school students, tapping syllables, I don't know about that, right? And what we know from Anita Archer and we know from neuroscience is that phonology links the meaning in our brain. Phonology anchors the meaning. So understanding the sounds in the word will ensure the meaning and the spelling are both anchored into the brain. So we do want to make sure the students can pronounce the word, even at middle school and high school. Okay, here we go. The word is obnubilate. Obnubilate. Say the word, press and hold the space bar.
Obnubilate.
Obnubilate.
Good. Now, just to make sure we're saying it right, I'm going to tell you the syllables in obnubilate, then you're going to tell them back to me. Ready? Obnubilate. You do it.
Obnubilate.
Very nice. Obnubilate. And that B syllable, it's actually one that we say really, really fast because it's what my friend Antonio Fierro would call a schwa. It is a schwa syllable. So it's just kind of like this quick, So obnubilate is a schwa syllable. So now I'm going to connect it to the spelling. So you can see, whoops, I went the wrong way. So you can see how this connects to spelling. So here we go. Here's my word. I'm going to underline each syllable. As I underline it, you're going to tell me it. Ready?
Noob. Late.
Obnubilate. So let's talk about this first syllable, pretty self-explanatory, closed syllable, short O, ob, got it. Here, second syllable, new. This is an open syllable, so this U is going to shout its name, which is why we say obnubilate and not obnubilate. And then this syllable, this I, it doesn't shout its name and represent the sound I. Instead, it's kind of that obnubilate. It's an sound. What did we say that was called?
Schwa.
Schwa. That's a schwa sound. And how are we spelling the schwa in this word?
I.
with the
I.
letter I. Now remember, schwa can be spelled anyway, but we're going to spell it with the letter I. It can be spelled with any vowel. And then here we have a vowel consonant, E syllable. This is a long A sound because this E is here to help the A represent its name. So obnubilate.
Obnubilate.
Obnubilate. Now, as we talk about this word's meaning, I think this one is helpful to take a look at some of its morphemes because that's really going to help us with the meaning. So ob means in front of. So ob is the prefix that means in front of. This is a Latin word, by the way. And then we have nubil, which is from it's nubis, which is clouds. And 8 is my suffix. Now, 8's an interesting suffix, and Carolyn and I were laughing as we were kind of doing a little homework on this particular suffix, in that this particular suffix could be used with nouns, it could be used with verbs, and it could be used with adjectives. But in this case, this is the verb version of 8. So if you think of a word like I'm going to graduate or I'm going to duplicate something, that's the verb. But we also know we have a duplicate noun as well that ends in 8. So it's interesting. But in this case, we're going to talk about this in terms of a verb. So this is a verb that means that we're going to block something, or we're going to make it a little bit cloudy, or maybe we're going to darken it. So we're going to kind of block it, make it cloudy, or darken it. So use this gesture. I know I can't see y'all, but that's okay. I'm gonna trust you're doing it. This is our Jane Fonda for today. And you don't have to say it with your camera or with your mic on, but just say, we're going to darken it. We're going to make something cloudy. We're going to darken it. We're going to make something cloudy.
It's so cloudy.
When we darken something and make it cloudy, ready? What's the word? We do what to it?
Obnubilate.
Obnubilate it.
Obnubilate.
We obnubilate it. When we darken it, we make it cloudy. We cover it up. We obnubilate. So I could say, and so now I'm moving into, just so you guys know, so I did step 1, I did step 2. I'm going to talk about examples and non-examples. So I could say the clouds obnubilate the sun. That's kind of like plain, right? But I could also say my mood was obnubilated by the growing pandemic. Or, my mood was obnubilated by the bad news that I received. My jovial, happy mood was obnubilated. I could say that the teenage girl used makeup to obnubilate the pimple on her face. Although I'm a middle-aged woman, and on occasion I have to obnubilate the pimples on my face as well. So whenever we obnubilate something, remember, we're going to cover it up, darken it, make it cloudy. And that's what obnubilate is. It's that verb. We're going to do that to something. So let's see here. If my mood stays the same and I'm happy and jovial and I stay happy and jovial, did I obnubilate my mood? Yes or no?
No.
No. If the sun is shining and it's a beautiful day and we're getting a tan at the pool, is anything obnubilating the sun?
No.
No.
No, not at all. But if it's cloudy and it's overcast at night and you're sitting outside and you're looking and you're trying to find this constellation to show your children, but it's cloudy and overcast and you can't see any stars, are we obnubilating those stars?
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. So there's your yes and no for checking for understanding. Helpful? Not helpful?
Yes. Helpful.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to stop there just for the sake of time because I'm looking going, oh, 1:20. We still have more stuff to cover. And Carolyn's probably sending me a text going, okay, Michelle, that's enough talk about vocabulary. But I would love for you to either type into the chat box or unmute and tell us anything about this routine that was helpful, not helpful, stood out to you, and while Carolyn shifts screens. Carolyn and I did just, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'll just say I love the routine. I've used the routine. I've taught a lot of teachers the routine. And the hardest part is making it quick and snappy and not letting it take up your entire period.
You need to be able to teach each word in about 3 to 5 minutes max, like 3 to 5 minutes. And we also don't teach 20 words this way, right? We're going to do 3 to 5 words, right? And that's it. And then we're going to next day, we'll introduce some more while reviewing the old.
Yeah, students, our readers learn this vocabulary explicitly, but they also learn a lot of those words incidentally as well through that wide reading. So that's why teaching the critical content, teaching the background knowledge, teaching the foundational skills are important so that they can read more on their own. That's how we learn more words. We learn more words by wide reading. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit more. So you remember in that simulation that Michelle really did take you through the phonology of the word. She wanted to be sure that you could pronounce the word, because if you can pronounce the word, that helps to attach the meaning to the phonological processor in your brain. Again, we could talk about the brain, we could talk about the processors and how we build a good reading brain, but you've got this processor in your brain called the phonological processor. And that's how, by saying the word and tapping out the syllables and, talking about the syllable types and how to break apart that word, that gives you a memory for then instant retrievals. Okay, that's multisensory. Okay, when you can tap into that phonological processor, that's the multisensory piece of that vocabulary instruction. Okay, again, we have a couple checklists for you to think about. What does vocabulary instruction look like, sound like across the board? Think about this in your PLCs and your TBTs and your building leadership teams. Do you have a process for how you teach vocabulary? And do you have a process for how words are selected? Sometimes the words that the publishers decide upon are not the words that necessarily need to be taught. So think about those in terms of the critical pieces of vocabulary, because then it really makes a difference as we move into background knowledge. Do our students have adequate background knowledge to read the text that they are presented? It has a major impact. It's it's hard to learn something if you don't know at least something about the topic. You all know a lot of things, but when I presented that topic on the brain and dyslexia, that was an area where you may not have known a whole lot about. So we have to build up that knowledge so that you can read that text. And we do this across the grade levels. And in fact, we don't wait to do it. We start right away in preschool, in building knowledge. Preschool curricula that work to build on themes and concepts and core pieces of knowledge really then help to translate into better readers. And there are core curriculum, that do that in preschool. Our friend, Dr. Amy Murdoch at Mount St. Joseph University, she found that preschool core curricula were really lacking in the knowledge building piece. So she wrote her own. It's called Project Ready. And it's a curriculum that builds on pieces of knowledge, themes. You learn, preschoolers learn about North America. Preschoolers learn about the solar system. Preschoolers learn about habitats and weather. But it's about building that knowledge early and having that stair-stepping of knowledge over time. These are a couple of resources for you. Susan Newman is a great resource. And also Dr. Laura Justice writes a lot about building knowledge and critical content. But bottom line is we have to teach in our elementary schools science and social studies, okay? Because our students who are reading 20 minutes or more a day of outside reading are going to read exponentially more words than our students who are only reading maybe 5 minutes a day, especially in those lower level text. But we do want to give kind of a caveat to that wide reading and that 20 minutes a day of reading. We want to make sure that, yes, we are promoting wide independent reading, but we don't want to do that independent reading during class time. We want them to be reading in class, but that independent reading should also be occurring outside. When the expert is there, AKA the teacher is bringing their knowledge into that scaffolding of the text. And here we come back to that Matthew effect, where kids who read more, they know more, and they also want to read more. And so looking at that Matthew effect again, and that wide reading is what really builds and really does kind of cut that equity gap and cut that knowledge gap. Yeah, the Kate Kinsella toolkits are fantastic, especially if you have a high population of English language learners as well. Okay, so we want to be intentional about teaching vocabulary. These aren't just words that we pull off of our shelf. We also just don't teach random areas of content. You know, just like we have a scope and sequence of foundational skills, our scope and sequence of content should also be happening from preschool all the way up through elementary school into our middle schools and high schools. We want to make sure that there's a streamlined kind of progression of how we teach these critical concepts. Some programs do an excellent job of that, that have their own scope and sequence for knowledge. And again, we have some things for you to consider if you're really thinking about, does our school teach background knowledge, teach content in an equitable and an accessible way? Because really the bottom line is it's that background knowledge that plays a key role in student understanding and student comprehension. If our students don't have that sufficient related knowledge, they're really going to struggle in understanding text. And I think you saw that when we took you through the simulation of the dyslexic brain. All right, Michelle, you want to start to wrap us up with critical content?
Absolutely. You and I both must be having like some serious allergy issues.
I don't know whether it's allergies or what's going on, but yeah. It got real humid down here in Cincinnati. It was super nice yesterday, but today the humidity kicked up, and I'm wondering if that's what it is.
I know. I've not cleared my throat this much in a 2-hour session in a very long time. Okay. So we're going to talk about our focusing on critical content and keeping our students in the text. So what practice, you have a poll coming up here, what practice is most effective? Now, let me give you the caveat here. All of these are awesome. All of these are great strategies for building knowledge based on what you've read. But which of these is the most effective for building knowledge from content you've read? Go for it and vote. They're all great, but what's the greatest? So the good news is there isn't a bad answer, but there is the best answer. These all have an evidence base. We're missing about 5 voters. So Carolyn, we put maybe 4 or 5. Oh, there we go. There comes one more. Maybe we put 4 people to sleep. But what do I always say about that? If you could sleep through this voice, you must be really tired. So I'm going to let you go. When I taught high school, that's what I used to say. Students would say, Mrs. Eliad, so-and-so fell asleep. I'm like, if they could sleep through all this, they need the sleep. Okay, I don't see those last 3 votes coming in. So go ahead and share the results. And so you all said rereading the text was the majority of you said was the correct answer. Again, they are all evidence-based. Rereading the text is important. Rereading notes taken from the text, also helpful. And answering questions about the text, helpful. But the correct answer is, let me get my annotate tool here. Carolyn will laugh because I'm never slow on the annotate, but this time I am. The correct answer is C. Answering questions about the text, especially using mini quizzes. Very, very effective retrieval practice. You're right. And again, Michelle, even if you picked A or B, you were right in that they were all effective. Rereading is effective. We need to encourage our students to do that. Even us as good readers, we reread text all the time. Rereading notes and taking notes, especially 2-column notes, which we're going to give you an example of those.
Handwriting those notes too.
Oh, handwriting, yes, absolutely. Super critical, very helpful. And then also answering questions about the text, but the most impact, and we have a book that'll explain the research behind this, is answering questions about the text, or mini quizzes about the text, is the most impact. But you should do all 3.
Mhm. And actually, if you want to get an additional kind of bang for your buck, if you're going to have them answer those questions about the text, have them write the answers, not just a little multiple choice. Have them write out, write out those answers and then turn and talk with the partner about why they selected it.
Okay, so asking questions. So asking questions is an evidence-based, time-honored procedure, according to Anita Archer, right? It's effective, it's efficient retrieval practice. And in fact, there's an entire book on this topic that Carolyn and I are both a big fan of called Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning. Really focusing on how we retrieve, but also how we store information for long-term retrieval that we have been taught. And mini quizzes, like the ones we've been using all day today, are really, really effective. So little poll questions or turn and talk to your partner, ask a question, really effective. Yes, give them the answers and talk about why it's correct or not correct. Absolutely. Thank you, Michelle. You are so right. And the other thing is, we know from neuroscience that even if they get it wrong, it's still a really powerful learning experience because when they get it wrong, they have a response to it, a dopamine response in their limbic system. And I got to remember his name, what the neuroscientist's name was now. It's going to kill me that I cannot remember, but he calls it the dopamine post-it note. He's like, it's a dopamine post-it note that goes on their brain and says, remember this, because if they get it wrong, they have that really emotional response to it. So they're going to be more likely to remember it. So it's not bad to get it wrong either, especially when we give them that feedback. John Medina was the neuroscientist. I knew it would come to me. Okay, so when we ask questions, what kind of questions are we going to ask? We're going to ask text-dependent questions. So these questions can only, so here's those shifts again, they can only be answered with evidence from the text or content we presented. So you have to read the text in order to answer them. Kids can't just draw on their background knowledge. You have to go into the text to answer them. But this is how we build that background knowledge, right? And this is why going back to the text sets, why they're so important, because they can draw on previous background knowledge, but they're also going to have some background knowledge to stick it to. It's that Velcro to make it stick. So these questions should help assess the understanding of the text, not necessarily what you knew before reading the text. Background knowledge is kind of a sticky wicket in that we know you need to have some to get some, and we know that students who have it do better on standardized tests. But we want to make sure that our questions, ready, keep kids in the text, not out of the text. In the text, not out of the text. And that's Anita Archer. You don't have to sing it. She does it, so I sing it because I want to be here when I grow up. But we really want to make sure that those questions are based on the text so students focus in, not out of the text. Now, if you are going to ask questions that relate to themselves or personal questions, that's not a bad thing, but don't do it until after we've monitored for comprehension. Because if we do it before that, we actually can reduce their comprehension of the content itself. So it's still a good thing to connect to themselves, but we don't do that first. We do that after we've made sure that they understand the text by asking questions that keep them in the text.
You don't want them to provide some inaccurate knowledge that they're going to be bringing with them to the text that could kind of, taint their overall understanding.
Absolutely. So other strategies to keep students in the text, reviewing elements of story grammar, which, we have lots and lots of wonderful graphic organizers for that. We talked about 2-column notes. I'm a big fan of 2-column notes. We actually shared with you in the Padlet webinars from Keys to Literacy, which are free, on how to use 2-column notes with main idea and supporting details, but also top-down topic webs, which are super fun. Again, the idea of those main ideas and the supporting details from the text that we're reading. And Joan Sedita and her crew give a lot of wonderful examples for both fiction and nonfiction using these 2 tools. But then also back to that question about writing. I don't remember who said it. Was it Michelle or was it Jennifer? Oh, I think it was Jennifer. We know that writing is the best form of retrieval practice. Writing is so important for retrieval practice, even a quick write. So writing about the text we're reading are ways to focus on critical content and keep kids in the text, not out of the text. So we love the Writing Revolution. That training on pedagogy is so, it's been really helpful for Carolyn and I. We also love the training that we received in Writing Matters on the importance of syntax. And so that pedagogy is super helpful in connecting kids to text. So we put one of the strategies, because, but, so, into your Padlet. And for K through 2, when they're just learning to write, it starts with that oral language and then connected to writing. But beginning in kindergarten, we start teaching syntax and sentence structure. We begin teaching that syntax for writing in kindergarten, using more decodable sentences that we dictate and have the students write. Using words and patterns that they already know how to spell that we've taught in phonics. So it's going to start with dictation and oral language. So I could use something like because, but, so. So maybe I would say this character, oh boy, I can't come up with what's going off my head. This character did this because, this character did this, but, or this character did this, so. And so we could use these sentence starters, which are really helpful and powerful to encourage our students to write very, very complex sentences. Yeah, sentence anagrams are awesome for this. We could start using those in kindergarten through 2nd grade. I did give you a webinar I did on scaffolding complex text with some of these strategies in it under additional resources. If you want another webinar, if you could stomach listening to me again.
That graphic organizer can also be done as a living graphic organizer, where instead of having them write down on just a printed sheet of paper, you have topics and terms and subordinate categories, and then they have to rearrange, like physically rearrange themselves in the room, and then they place their cards down. So there's all kinds of interactive ways you can do this with K2, because what you don't want to do is just have them struggle to copy something off the board. You want to bring as much of the language piece of it into play as possible, because the texts are all language based. That's the teacher reading the text out loud to the students.
Carolyn, I'm so glad you wrote The Powers in the Struggle. I love that. What do we call that? The learning pit, where our students are struggling to climb out, that's where the magic happens. That's, again, why we want to use complex text and not the leveled text, right? Because without the struggle, without that productive struggle, how are our kids going to grow? And Luke, I know you had a really good quote on that I said was tweet worthy, and now I don't remember what it was. So you might have to write it into the chat or tell us out loud, because it was good.
But this all brings us back to that equity question, right? Because if we keep kids in the text, that puts everybody at the same, primarily the same playing field, right? If we depart from the text, that privileges the children, the students who already have knowledge on the topic. So the questions that we ask need to be text dependent, keep them into the text to keep everybody on that same playing field, so that kids who have more knowledge are benefited by that knowledge, but kids who have never heard of that topic or subject, don't have any chance of it. So again, when we think about critical content, think about what's happening in your school, in your classroom. Where are you in terms of reading aloud to students? Do you read aloud to your middle schoolers and high schoolers? If you don't, try it. It's fun. They love it. They love listening to just the language and the stories that are told. Think about how many text-dependent questions you're asking, okay? And then are available to students as they read, and the generating of the passages, bringing in narrative and informational text, retrieval practice. That's where that Make It Stick book is really powerful, and thinking about kind of the science behind how we learn. And then writing is really one of the most important retrieval and most impactful retrieval practices. All right, so let's just do a quick little retrieval practice. Type in the chat box quickly. What is comprehension? It's the ability to read the blank accurately and what? What are we reading?
The first two blanks. The first two blanks.
First two blanks. Type in the chat box. What goes in the first two blanks? What are we reading? We're reading the text, reading the words accurately and anyone remember? Correctly, fluently, good. Understanding, we have to be able to understand the what of the what. Meaning of the words, good. And we have to have adequate Good, background knowledge. And we want to focus on the critical what? Critical background knowledge, or critical starts with a C. Critical content. Excellent. All right, so again, to wrap this up, the words that are in bold, I want you to read those out loud with me. So what is comprehension? It's when the student reads the
Words accurately.
Words accurately and
good
fluently.
and understands the
Meaning
Meaning
of
of
the
the
word.
words.
good, has adequate
Background knowledge.
and
Knowledge.
focuses attention on the
Critical
content.
content.
Oh, perfect, perfect, perfect. Such good learners. So we provided some strategies, and I don't like to say strategies because they're really not strategies. I suppose they're more instructional tools, instructional practices, I guess would be a better way to put this. Some instructional practices to use before students read a text, while they're reading a text, but also connecting knowledge after they're finished reading a text. Because if we aren't going to culminate the reading in something, students kind of lose interest in that. So before reading, there are some things that we want to think about as we are planning, and all of this takes a great amount of pre-planning before going into the text or the content or the lesson. Things to think about while students are reading, and then things to help keep students connected to the text after they are finished reading. Because all of this is really meant to support our learners. And notice we put all in that big, bold print in capital letters. We draw a lot of our equity work, our focus on, especially students with disabilities. All of our students should have the potential to grow their language and literacy skills. That's what presumed competence is. And we pulled this quote from our dear friend Shauna Benson, who is with Ocali, and she pretty much says it best of all. And I don't know if she got this quote from somebody, or she always has a most eloquent way of putting her words. All education professionals have to enter the teaching profession with foundational values and foundational beliefs that welcome and support all learners. Beliefs is the potential of all learners, sits at the heart of our work as educators. These essential beliefs and practices, they are the roots that ground our work in providing high quality, equitable, and accessible instruction and assessment. And so in order for us to provide this support, this scaffolding, as we've been talking about, towards the reading of rigorous text, we have to understand and have this belief that all learners can do it, that all learners have the ability to grow their language and literacy skills. So with that, I'm going to give you some think time for a minute and complete this sentence frame. Yeah, let's do that. We've got a few minutes. I'm going to put you back in those breakout rooms, okay? And I want you to think about this sentence frame. Before I thought, but now I know. Just have a quick conversation with your friends in this breakout room on before I thought, and now I know. I'll see you back in about 3 minutes after this conversation.
Do we have some folks who need help moving into their breakout room? So if you guys aren't moved, one of the things that could be is if you have another window also open, it might not let you move. So make sure that Zoom is at the front.
You may have stepped away for a moment.
Yeah, I think that's possible too.
Okay, I'm gonna give what do you think? 3 minutes?
Absolutely. And I'll go check on another room. I'll go join some conversation. See you soon.
You don't.
Once again, Carolyn, I was in some rooms with really good conversation.
Yeah, it's nice. It's nice. Gives us a little bit of a break, but it's, 2 hours is a long time to just sit and listen. So being able to kind of process those thoughts. Did you have anyone that was or wanted to share or how to
Well,
proceed?
I want to mention something, whole group, and then allow the group I just left to jump in and add to this, because this really came from Meredith, a question that Meredith posed, but I really love it. And it's something that we didn't talk about that we always usually do. And I want to make sure we make it clear. So first of all, as we're talking about grade level texts, grade level content, that is what our students are getting in core instruction. But that doesn't mean we don't meet kids where they are, especially if they have a gap in decoding. We do have to go back and meet them where they are. But when do we do that? We do that in tier 2 or tier 3, which are the interventions. That's where we meet them where they are. So core instructions at grade level. So if you're thinking of that triangle, right? Tier 1, grade level, core instruction. We meet them where they are to close the gaps in tier 2 and 3, which could be considered like a flex time, or some people call it intervention time, or no new learning time, or I worked at this one school that they called it Quaker time. I mean, whatever you call it, that's the time where we find those skills and intervene where the students are. But during grade level content, then that's where we are teaching grade level standards and content. Okay, and Meredith, did I miss anything with that?
No, I think you're good on that.
Yeah, we usually do throw in some kind of multi-tier system of support, tiers of instruction. But again, we had 2 hours to get in like days worth of content. So we had to focus in on the critical content of the conversation today. Yeah, text-based. Before I thought, man, am I crazy for being the only person in my school? And now I know I was right. Nice job, Luke. Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts before and now? Well, hopefully today you have some key takeaways that we, of course, that was the title of the presentation, right? Access to rigorous text. And this is done daily. You have to build this up. This isn't just a once a week kind of thing where you expose a little bit of knowledge here and a little bit of knowledge there, and you read a book and you give them a book and that kind of thing. This is part of the work. This is part of your daily lesson planning, and doing it through read alouds and scaffolding of instruction, building background knowledge through those text sets. And, when we talked about those text sets, a text in the set could be a quick video. It could be a short little infographic, okay? Explicitly teaching vocabulary. And you can't do that routine that Michelle was doing with 20 words. We have to focus in on the key vocabulary that students are going to need to understand not only that text, but sometimes we teach vocabulary that's going to transfer over into other text. That's the beauty of that tier 2 vocabulary. And we want to ensure that all students know how to decode, because without those critical decoding foundational skills, accessing those complex texts is going to be extremely difficult. So even in our middle schools and potentially our high schools, if you have students who are not reading the words on the page accurately and fluently, we have to think about our tiers of intervention and tiers of supports to provide that access to them. Okay, the PowerPoint is located in the Padlet. It's a PDF, like Michelle said. And before you head out, you see our contact information is on the screen, but we also wanted to share with you the link to the survey, the exit ticket. And I'm told that once you fill out that exit ticket, that'll generate a certificate of attendance for you. We'll hang on for a little bit longer in case anybody has questions. But other than that, you've been a fantastic audience. Good luck to the start of the school year. Oh, the Padlet link. Yes, I shall do that. Do you have that ready, Michelle?
Yeah, I can get that right here. I have it right here.
I had it and I closed out my browser.
No worries, I got it. That's why we're a team.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to stop recording, Carolyn.
Perfect.
Because sometimes questions come through a little bit more when we stop the recording.